Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Spitfire on My Tail, part 11. As we were really reserve pilots, as far as the rest of the organization seemed to be concerned, we sometimes got interesting ferrying jobs to do. They were the kind of assignments we all wanted in the absence of actually joining a fully equipped fighter unit. This one concerned Hinnerk Waller, Fähnrich Kase and myself. We were to take the train to Cologne to pick up 3 Arado AR-68s. It was well over the range of the Arado, and so it would mean at least one stop for fuel. It was very short notice, but I still arranged a train stopover in Stuttgart, which would allow us to catch the local service to Heutigsheim and visit my parents. The only real problem was our parachutes, but with a few smiles from the railway staff, we checked them in at Stuttgart station as left luggage. It was worth the effort though, as the 3 of us enjoyed my mother's speciality, Sauerbraten. We arrived at Cologne on the Saturday, ready to fly out on Sunday morning, but the weather officer refused to rubber stamp on our flight plans because of threatening thunderstorms. I remembered my earlier experience with storm clouds and was content to wait. But as it was, an alternative route via Gießen was suggested, which would circumnavigate the area of storms. To ease the strain of having to fly and navigate at the same time, we agreed to fly in V formation, with the leader setting the course. We would change around, each having a turn at the difficult task of squadron leader. The first lap fell to Hinnerk, who kept us on course through bad conditions. The Arado was of course open cockpit, and it was raining heavily, which was very unpleasant indeed. Hinnerk must have thought to land at Frankfurt, but we could see that the sky that was nearly black, and so we stuck to the plan, landing in Gießen. After refueling, we got permission to proceed if we took another wide detour to land at Karlsruhe, which lies in the flat Rhine Valley. Kase was to take the lead, but soon after we had taken off, he began to gesticulate wildly, making signs which we didn't understand at all. Not knowing what else to do, I pushed forwards, making it clear that I would take the lead. I felt confident to do so, as this was on the edge of what I saw as my homeland. Hinnerk seemed happy to follow my lead, and Kase slowly came to form up on the other side of me. Soon the weather improved, and we could clearly see the Frankfurt-Karlsruhe Autobahn, and I dropped down rather low, about 100 meters above the cars and lorries. I saw Kase drop down even lower, apparently comparing speeds with the cars, and then I lost sight of him, but I wasn't too worried, as he would only have to follow the Autobahn to find Karlsruhe. Hinnerk and myself landed without incident and soon heard the approach of Kase. He landed and taxied the aircraft right over to the repair workshop. Thinking that he might, after all, have had a mechanical problem, we walked over in the pouring rain to see what was up. Kase was really mad with me, saying that I'd led them into a thunderstorm and that his Arado had been hit by lightning, forcing him to fly too low. I was shocked, but that didn't last for long. We only had been there a while when a report came in of a biplane hitting some power lines which ran across the Autobahn just north of Karlsruhe. 2 villages had been blacked out, and Kase had had a very lucky escape. When faced with this, Kase admitted what had happened, which was obvious from the cuts and burns on the leading edges of the wings. There was no chance that anyone was going to believe the lightning story. We were really mad with him for trying to blame us and left him to it, not bothering to have anything more to do with him. He stayed at the airfield, trying to get the emergency repair crew to patch up the aircraft if he would pay for it himself. Before taking off on the Monday morning, Kase told us that his aircraft would be ready in 2 days. The repair shop was only going to make it fit to fly. The full repairs would have been too expensive for Kase. He asked us to report the damage, but we promised that we wouldn't reveal how it happened. We'd leave that to him to explain. We set off on a next leg of the flight, which to me was the most important. I had originally agreed to lead on this leg because it was over my ground, and my mother had told us that she had organized a Sängerfest, which is a local competition for choirs, in Heutigsheim. It was to begin on the Sunday, but it also included the Monday, which traditionally was the Children's Day. I had hinted that, if all was well, we might pay them a visit. I easily found the site, and Hinnerk and myself made a few circles around the area to let them know that we were around. It was exciting to see the mass of people that suddenly erupted from the big tent, all scanning the sky, looking for us. We put on quite a display, diving at full throttle and making hard banking turns, returning at ground zero to beat the place up. Unusually for Hinnerk, who was a bit of a stickler for discipline, he followed me, adding much to the display, which was really quite impressive for such an isolated village. Maybe he felt that he should repay the Sauerbraten. After 5 minutes we took our leave of them and continued on our way. The wind was on our tails, and so we decided to bypass Augsburg and made it back to Bad Aibling in one hit. We waited anxiously for a few days, but no report of our unofficial display came in. The day after our return, we reported to our new squadron leader, Oberleutnant Ulrich, that we had lost Kase due to mechanical problems and that he'd be along in due course. When he did arrive and the truth came out, we got a royal dressing down and he was confined to barracks for a week and had an entry made on his dossier. Bad Aibling was a very pleasant place to be, with swimming and sailing available on the Chiemsee, and we were close to the beautiful and historic town of Rosenheim. I had a new girlfriend, Ruth Schubert, who was living with her foster parents, White Russians, who had exiled themselves after the revolution. I got to be friends with them and even experienced a traditional Russian goose dinner with lots of vodka to ease the digestion. It was quite a feast. For the most part, we were still part of a military unit and the social side of our lives was secondary to our work and training. My next real assignment was to provide air attack experience for the SS regiment Feldherrnhalle whilst they were on maneuvers. I don't know if it was the fact that they were an SS regiment, but there was no problem at all in our squadron getting aircraft and fuel for the exercise. We moved to Neubiberg, north of Munich, for the day, and because of this we couldn't take our mechanics. We had, therefore, to learn to start the aircraft on our own. This entailed stepping onto the wing with the cranked starting handle and winding up the starter flywheel to a fairly high speed. You then step back into the cockpit and engage the starter, hoping that there was enough momentum in the flywheel to turn the engine over fast enough to fire. If you were lucky, it worked the first time, but if not, it was a case of try again. In the warmth of the summer, you would really start to sweat in the heavy flying overalls. But once the engine had fired and could be kept hot, the starting was no problem. To help with this, we generally kept the radiator shutters closed to prevent cooling. This had helped me when our scramble came and my engine fired the first time, and I was soon in the formation ready to attack the SS. I suppose this was my first experience of any kind of combat, and a whole host of thoughts went through my mind as we dived on the marching columns and vehicles, watching them dive for the ditches and loose off all manner of blank charges from a whole arsenal of assorted weapons. Then it started to rain, first lightly and then, apparently, much harder. What I didn't realize was that the larger part of the liquid which was obscuring my vision was coming from my own engine. I had just assumed that the rain had become heavier, although the alarm in my mind had started to ring as I found the peculiar taste of boiled off coolant beginning to coat my tongue. It was my wingman who flew towards me, giving the cutthroat sign to indicate that all was not well, which really galvanized me into action. The first instinct was to check the instruments, and I saw right away that the engine coolant and oil temperatures were way into the red. Then I saw that the radiator shutter was still indicating closed. In my excitement to take off, and in the new experience of the attack, I hadn't opened the radiator shutter, and now my engine was close to seizing up. I opened the shutter and, to my relief, the temperatures dropped immediately. Because the engine stopped boiling, the weather improved, as did my visibility, and we continued our strafing attacks on the helpless regiment Feldherrnhalle. I had only made a few dives and climbs when the temperature began to go up again. I must have boiled off too much coolant when the engine was hot, and now there wasn't enough to take the heat out of the engine properly. I remembered the instruction for this kind of case and decided that the risk of minor damage to the airframe during an emergency landing was preferable to a blown-up engine. I cut the ignition and selected a suitable field, remembering my flying school instructor's words: "Once you've found the field in which you're going to land, stick to it. Never change your mind at the last minute." This was a case of the last minute, but I stuck to my decision. I had made my approach upwind to reduce my airspeed and was on course when I noticed, too late, that the field in fact sloped downwards in the direction of landing. Well, I was committed and touched down, trying to use the brakes as much as possible to slow up. It didn't work and, still moving quite quickly, I rolled into the plowed field. Ahead of me lay a ditch. I couldn't risk losing the undercarriage there, so I applied the brakes harder, and slowly but surely the wheels began to dig into the soft earth and the tail began to rise. With a final lurch, the tail came right up and the propeller sank deep into the soil. It felt very odd to be that far up in the cockpit, but I climbed down to inspect the damage. I was really depressed now. This was the second accident I'd had, and I couldn't help but think that the consequences might be serious. Taking out my pocket knife, I scraped away the clay and earth from the propeller and was encouraged to see that there seemed to be little damage. Similarly, the rest of the aircraft was sound. Thoroughly depressed, I trudged across the muddy fields in my boots and overalls, the rain now returning to make conditions even worse. Every now and then I would have to stop to kick heavy accumulation of clay from my boots, which made them very heavy and walking difficult. When I reached the farm, the owner was completely surprised, having heard nothing. I was able to telephone Schleißheim airfield and report my location, asking for fuel and coolant for the engine and also for another pilot because I was too dirty to get back into the aircraft. After that, I set off back to the aircraft with the farmer. He loaned me a huge butcher's knife, and with it I carefully excavated the propeller, paring the heavy clay away from it. Then, when all seemed to be clear, we managed to get the tail down and things didn't look half as bad as they had. Just as we had finished, the truck arrived, and it didn't take them long to find that there hadn't been a leak from the cooling system. It was obvious that the radiator had overheated. We topped up the fuel and the NCO pilot gave the engine a full run-up to test that it was ready to fly and couldn't find anything wrong. With our help of pushing on the wings, he pushed the throttle fully forwards and the aircraft was in the air again in no time. When I got back, I claimed that I'd had the radiator shutters sticking, half closed, and Robic believed me. In view of the fact that I'd taken measures to prevent further damage and performed an incredibly good emergency landing without damage to the aircraft, there was no further action. I was relieved to be off the hook once more. Rumors had been circulating for a while that Max Ibel was none too happy with the number of squadrons that were operating from Bad Aibling. 2 whole groups, 6 squadrons, was just too much for the limited resources. He got his way, and we were soon on the move to Herzogenaurach, just north of Nürnberg. It had been a training center for basic flying, but that was being run down. The important thing was that we got an official name. We were the first group of Squadron 333. The group commander was Major Stoltenhoff, and Robic remained as our squadron leader. We were joined by another influx of new faces. Some were Fähnriche direct from the schools, and others had been drafted in from other groups. Overall, the situation wasn't a lot different, too many pilots and too few aircraft. At least there were some 109s in the group, but none were with our squadron. Very soon after the move, the order came through to promote all the Fähnriche to Oberfähnriche. That was very important because it brought the pay up to the same level as a Stabsfeldwebel, which is a staff sergeant, which was only one level of pay below the lieutenant. All were promoted with the exception of 3, Fähnrich Helmut Wick, who had joined us from another unit, Fähnrich Kase, and last, but by no means least, Fähnrich Steinhilper. I was desperately disappointed, not knowing why I had been left out. At the time, I didn't know too much about Helmut Wick's background, but it was obvious why Kase had been singled out. I was aware that I'd made a few mistakes and had a couple of near misses, but I couldn't reconcile any of those with this sanction. I couldn't get a firm answer from my squadron leader and was left to brood about it on my own. One thing which did come from this was that Helmut Wick and I became firm friends, and he revealed to me why he had been picked out for special treatment. He said that he had a fiancée whom he wanted to marry at any cost. However, when he had applied to the officers' committee for permission to marry, they had refused him on the grounds that 1. He was too young, and 2. He should forget the woman to whom he was engaged. Apparently, she was a divorcee and the officers didn't want any hint of scandal attached to their cadets. Actually, there are many people today, even in Germany, who don't know of the tradition of the officer corps that the committee had the facility to vet potential brides-to-be. I don't know what he'd said at the time, I presume he must have agreed, but he was determined never to give up this woman. He told me that when the fighting started, he would show them all up by becoming an ace. Then, he said, they won't talk to me like that anymore. Certainly, Wick became a very hungry hunter when the opportunity arose, and he had the reputation of being a young man with a very sore throat. It is interesting to be able to see in retrospect what may have motivated one of the Luftwaffe's most successful pilots. This obviously explained Wick's problems, but I could think of no good reason why I was apparently being discriminated against. I tried everything I could to find out what was wrong, but to no avail. I asked Robic and even applied to see Major Stoltenhoff, but there was no result. Robic reassured me that I'd be alright in the end, but this was no real help. I felt somewhat ashamed of what I saw as a slight on my character and decided not even to tell my parents. The mystery was only solved about a year later, when I was a full lieutenant with the first group of Jagdgeschwader 52. Die whole Gruppe, under the command of Hauptmann Graf von Pfeil and Klein Elgut, had left Böblingen for gunnery training on the island of Wangerooge in the North Sea. I had been left alone as communications officer and jack of all trades, but as a consequence, I had access to all the personnel files. I took the opportunity to look at my dossier, and there, dating back to Wildpark, was the report of one Oberleutnant Schmidt, detailing his strong doubts about my potential as an officer. It said, Wastefulness and an inability to handle money, and of course there was subtle reference to the window incident, which said, "Weak and disciplined, a rebel. Steinhilper is not the kind of fellow that others are likely to follow," etc. It was a good job that I was already a lieutenant then, or I might well have gone looking for Schmidt to make his worst fears for me come true. As it was, I still didn't know what I had done wrong, but things were beginning to hot up over the problems of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, and the possibility of war galvanized all military units into action and helped, at that time, to take my mind off my problems. The successful Anschluss in Austria had led Hitler to look at Czechoslovakia as the next extension of his expansion of Germany. Czechoslovakia had been created out of part of the old Habsburg Empire following the end of the First World War in 1918. It was another piece of the Treaty of Versailles which so offended the German people. The original concept of Thomas Mlárek and Eduard Benes, two exceptional Czech intellectuals, had been to create a system of cantons like Switzerland, complete with its neutral status. To do this, they had to cobble together a people made up of several ethnic races, also, historically, like the Swiss. It was the minority groups that would cause the internal problems within the fledgling state. There were, amongst others, 1 million Hungarians, 500,000 Ruthenians and 3,200,000 Sudeten Germans, all of whom looked to the motherlands for guidance. The country was internally unstable as the groups fought for power and to influence the course of the country to the best advantage for their particular race. This was inevitable in any such new creation, but Hitler was to use it to attack this part of the hated Versailles Diktat. When he became Chancellor in 1933, Hitler had extended the hand of friendship to the Sudeten Germans, and, as a result, a brother party to the NSDAP had been formed in Czechoslovakia, the Sudeten-Deutsche Partei, the German Party of the Sudets. By 1935, the German Foreign Office was bleeding 15,000 marks per month into the funds of the SDP. 2 weeks after the annexation of Austria, Henlein, the party leader, was called to see Hitler, and apparently plans were made to further destabilize the government of Czechoslovakia by causing the large German minority to formulate demands which could never be met. Exactly the same tactic was used a year later to foment unrest in Poland over the so-called Polish Corridor and the seaport of Danzig. The German people didn't know anything of this at the time and just saw with pity that their fellow countrymen were having a hard time trying to assert their rights in Czechoslovakia. This, of course, was cleverly orchestrated by Dr. Goebbels, reporting more and more terror attacks against the Sudeten Germans by the Czechs. In the end, the question on everybody's lips was, when will the government act? Not, should the government act? As the crisis grew, so did our state of military preparedness and my personal anxiety about going to war. Our squadron was still woefully badly equipped, and we still had not undergone any tactical or weapons training. We had Arado 68s, which were capable of being armed, but only a few had guns fitted. Not that this really mattered, because we didn't have any armorers to load and maintain them. As the troubles began to peak in mid-May, we moved to Straubing near the Czechoslovakian border, where we were grouped up with some very old Dornier Do-23s. These were known by the pilots as the Flying Coffin. With a maximum airspeed of 260 km per hour and an open cockpit, it's easy to see why. It was with great relief we heard that again there wasn't to be any fighting. Apparently, the demonstrations of military might, squadrons of fighter and bombers cruising up and down the border between Bavaria and the Sudetenland, and 12 full divisions of the army standing in plain view, had been enough to convince the Czech government to accept the help of the German nation to stabilize the internal strife. To help to impress the Czechs, and probably to ensure that reports of great military strength were sent back to the British and French, all available units were flown into Czech airfields. We moved to Eger to form a part of the occupation force, leaving the Dorniers behind. The flight well illustrates the state-of-the-art as far as our ability to bring Czechoslovakia to her knees was concerned. We took off from Straubing for the 150-kilometer transfer flight to Eger. There were no armaments, no radio, and only one map for the squadron leader himself. We formed up in a formation of 3 Vs with Oberleutnant Ulrich in the lead, and we were so close together that we could see each other's faces. The weather wasn't too rosy, but at least the mountains weren't hidden by cloud, waiting to destroy any wayward flyers. After about an hour, it became clear to us all that we were off course. We had to be, or we'd have been close to our goal by then. We could see the Oberleutnant constantly looking down into his cockpit, checking the map, and then looking over the side, trying to get a good landfall. Pretty soon, he pointed to the map and then threw up his arms in despair. We were well and truly lost. What a situation. Only fuel for about 15 minutes, no map, and close to the border. We had no choice but to scatter, each going his own way and trusting to luck. In this case, I was the lucky one, soon seeing an airfield with trucks upon it. I was careful to make a low pass and make sure the trucks were German before I entered the circuit and landed. Amongst their vehicles they had a tanker, and fortunately they were happy to fuel my aircraft without any red tape. They then pointed out the direction of Eger and said that if I pulled up in a climb, I'd see the airfield with no problems. It took me 15 minutes to land at Eger, but it took the squadron 2 more days to assemble fully. A few, like Robic and Lieutenant Roth, had made it the first time, others were down on soccer fields, in meadows, anywhere there was enough grass. Fortunately, Eger was full of aircraft and very busy with constant movements, and the commanding officers didn't really have much time to question the ragged arrival of yet another ragtail squadron for the front. It is interesting to reflect now and to hear the comments of many historians who record that the modern and well-equipped forces of the German Wehrmacht marched into Czechoslovakia and that resistance would have been pointless and hopeless. Certainly from my perspective, and that of very many others, we were just a hodgepodge of personnel of very varied experience and training, in aircraft which either belonged in a museum or weren't armed anyway. Another gigantic bluff had come off. At Eger, all was bustle and chaos. It took me a while to find Robic, and when I did, although he was pleased to see another of his pilots, he didn't have time to issue any instructions for me or the others. He was too busy trying to locate the stragglers. We were just told to go to town, report to the quartermaster office, and to be back at Eger Airport the next day. We took a military bus from the airfield and arrived at the school where the quartermaster had made his HQ. Our accommodation was to be, inevitably, in a classroom with straw palliaces on the floor. We had each brought a bag with our toilet requisites, clean underwear, and a better uniform. We decided that it was time for us to stage our own invasion and to step out into town. It was very strange for me and most of the others to be in a foreign town for the first time. Although there was a very substantial German minority in Czechoslovakia, based mainly in the Sudetenland, there were still many shop signs written in Czech. Many of the people had the high-boned facial features of the Slavs, and every now and then you'd catch a snatch of a foreign language. We could spend German money or exchange it for Czech money at the quartermasters, but on the whole it didn't matter to the local traders. Virtually all the guest houses and restaurants were open for business, and there was good beer and tasty food available right away. There was something of a party atmosphere as the SDP staged grand celebrations all over the Sudetenland. Every day there was a lot of flying. There would hardly be a moment when there wasn't a German aircraft in the sky over Eger. And then came the main flypast. The day wasn't ideal, with lots of turbulence, but the chance was taken to put 100 aircraft into the air. The bombers and Stukas came over the border, but the fighters, including us, joined them from Eger and came from the nearby base of Karlsbad. We had never flown in such tight formation, the up and down pitching of the aircraft bringing us with 2 meters of each other. In this situation I had to give my full concentration, my hand tight on the throttle lever, constantly adjusting my speed, and for brief moments I was able to feel what it was like to be part of such a huge formation which, had it been armed, would have had awesome destructive power. Time for the after action report. In this episode, again, a traditional German dish is mentioned, and you know what that means, so welcome to Kitchen Diaries. Now, as with most traditional German dishes, Sauerbraten is something that started as a peasant dish and is now a specialty. Same goes for Haxe or Eisbein, by the way. The point is to make either old meat or, in the very traditional sense, horse meat tender and edible, and to that matter, the meat is prepared by marinating it for 3 to 10 days in a mixture of vinegar, wine, herbs and spices. It is then cooked and served with a heavy gravy and potato side dishes like Kartoffelpuffer, Klöße or Spätzle. It's really quite tasty and can be ordered at most German restaurants worldwide. Now, off to the flying. Ulrich here talks about how he performed an ad hoc air show for his family. This is funny to me, as it is the exact kind of hijinks I would perform myself, knowing full well that most accidents, especially in general aviation, happen when students want to impress their family or some girl. We also learn about Helmut Wick. Now, Wick was a propaganda darling and also a very good pilot. He is said to have suffered from so-called sore throat, which at the time was parlance for wanting to earn a Knight's Cross. The Knight's Cross was worn on the neck, which is how this expression came into being. Now, he did achieve this actually. Not only did he earn the Knight's Cross, he also earned the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross after his 41st air victory. He also managed to marry his sweetheart girl in 1939, and they had 2 children. But he himself then was shot down on November 28, 1940 over the English Channel after scoring his 56th air victory. Just a quick side note, asking the army for permission before marriage was customary at the time, but it is no longer practiced, I can assure you. Only the French Foreign Legion still does, as far as I know. And finally, Czechoslovakia. This is a rather complex issue, and I will talk about it in detail in the next episode. Until then, stay safe, cheers, and bye-bye.